Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chronicles of Hollywood History, Past, Present, and Future. Welcome. And here now, Corey Gomez.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chronicles of Hollywood History, Past, Present, and Future. Today, I am joined by, a lot of people know him as Wojo from Barney Miller. I personally know him as Harold from DC Cab, but we all know he's an actor that is stage, screen, and film. I'm talking about Mr. Max Gail. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here. There.
I guess what I gotta ask everybody first: how'd you get started in the business?
Well, I'm not sure where the start was. I mean, my parents. I grew up in the Midwest, downriver Detroit, but my dad had been a piano player during the kind of the big band era. He had a band, not one of the famous ones, but they did their thing, and he had a small office supply store. And then the war came about, and he got stationed stateside and married my mom, and they had 7 kids in 6 years. My mother had 3 sets of twins, so she had 5 in 3 years and 7 in 6 years, and that put my dad behind the 8 ball to feed us all, and that's how he did it. He had started a booking agency in Detroit. Would book bands, guys that had been in his band had their own bands, and that sort of thing. And my mother had been an actress. I mean, she was 21 when she got married, but she had been into theater, and so she would participate in our local little small town amateur theater. So it wasn't like a strange left turn for my family. I know actors who, anyway, there was that, but it would have been my twin sister or my brother that people in the neighborhood would have said who's going to have a TV series, but so that was there as a possibility. I kind of learned chords on the piano and stuff, and I got through college and graduate school playing a couple rock bands and piano bar gigs. I knew a lot of the old songs because I grew up hearing them. And then as far as the acting, actually what happened, I was in graduate school in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. I had gone to college in Massachusetts. I majored in economics. I came back. I taught for 2 years in a private school that didn't care that I had no education. I just had gone to a small Eastern college and played sports, and that was what the dads who were sending their sons to the school, that's what they hoped for them. So, and then I went out to Ann Arbor and enrolled in the business school. Frankly, I always say I was majoring in staying out of Vietnam, because at that time, the war was not that, clear. There were many people who, were raised, that's what their dads did, and that's what they did, and that's what you did. And there were many people that just didn't have the options because they didn't have the advantage I had, that I could keep going to college, and I could pay for it by playing these gigs that didn't take 8 or 12 hours a day. And I learned in my 30s, up late one night with my mom, and she said something, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but all of a sudden it hit me that she had raised both my brother and I, just don't go. It wasn't real overt, but her dad, my grandfather, was a World War I psychological casualty. I guess these days it's called PTSD. Mm-hmm. There was a time they called shell shock, but he had an experience that we learned about, that he came across a young German soldier, out in the woods, and they just got into it and fought, and he won that fight, but he had, but he took a life to do it, and he grabbed I guess it was a Bible diary combination or something that, anyway, when he had it translated, it was told, it said, I know I'm fighting, God is on my side, and all of that. And that I guess, pretty much did it for my grandfather. he was a wonderful old Irish grandpa. But he, during the time that my mother was growing up, he would, do very well and then go off on a bender and disappear. And, there were a lot of difficulties. So, that's what caused me to take that opportunity to teach. That gave me the deferment, and then I went out to graduate school. So this is why I don't do sound bites. While I was there, you could take one course out of the business school, if it was a graduate level course, so that somebody could take a real estate law course or maybe an engineering course or something that would fit with their designs. And I was looking for what would be the furthest away. Because, so I found that there was a course in the business school. In the drama school. I couldn't get in an art course because I didn't have a portfolio, but there was a course called Theory of Acting. I thought, theory of acting. I guess we'll probably watch movies and write papers about it. I can handle that. I didn't really realize that it was the kind of introductory acting class for the graduate school. And I'm not sure why the professor let me in. But I talked to him about it. And anyway, so I had that experience under my belt. I did 2 semesters of it. It was interesting. Gilda Radner was in my class. There were some people that have gone on to have careers, but she's the most significant or well-known, But and then I moved out to San Francisco because it seemed like it was 1969. It seemed like there was a lot going on out there. I think I got there when the flower had wilted. It was wilting, I got some piano bar gigs, and I did some other things. But one day I saw that a stage play had opened up based on the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I had read that novel. That novel and the history book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was a wonderful book written by Dee Brown, who is a great historian and writer about the Native American history. And those were 2 books that really influenced me. And so on a fluke, I went down and read that they'd gotten a good review for the play from the kind of local, very popular columnist. The regular theatrical reviewers were not all that impressed, but Herb King gave it a big raise. So now they were looking for understudies, and they happened to put that in the want ads, and I happened to see it, and I went down to read for understudy, thinking that'll be interesting, and I got cast as the understudy, and then before I knew it, the guy playing the part had an argument, artistic differences about acting styles with one of the other players, and he was fired, and suddenly I was playing the part of the chief in the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm sure a lot of people listening have seen the movie, but that was a while back. So maybe they don't remember, but at the time it was an interesting look at what was going on in the world and in America, and so I ended up doing the play there for 2 years and getting some other acting gigs. I got a part in a movie called The Organization, which was kind of the second Mr. Tibbs movie, and I had my first speaking line in Dirty Harry. I had one line. And, I did some television thing, and at a point I thought, okay, I found something in it that was more about taking the mask off than putting it on. Acting involves both. As does life. But, so, I went down to Los Angeles to find a follow. I connected with some people who were involved with the Actors Studio, which is one of the approaches to acting. There are a lot of different teachers and ways to go about it. But so I went down there, then I went to New York, and I was invited to participate in a production of The Cuckoo's Nest that was playing there. And I did that, and I did a bunch of commercials and got a couple of small film parts, and came back to LA, and I started running long distances on the beach. And and that partly led to me starting to write rhymes, or songs that I would put to music that were processing my own kind of spiritual growth, or what's it all about growth. It wasn't like I was trying to write a hit song for the radio or something, and that opened me up creatively. So that was a start point. These were all start points, where did I start, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go down this road. But about that time, I got called in by Danny Arnold, who was the creative energy behind Barney Miller. He was a writer and director, a very talented guy, and it was his show. He was a Jewish guy who grew up in New York, single mom. He had been in the Marines. He'd been a writer for Jerry Lewis, and he'd done a number of sitcoms from kind of a previous era. My World and Welcome to It on James Thurber, and what was That Girl? That was the Danny Thomas. Marlo Thomas had a show for a while. So, and he had this idea of a Jewish captain who was kind of a mensch, in the squad room. And originally the show was half in the squad room and half at home. But the home stuff never quite got off the ground. But anyway, I went in and I read for Danny, and I got cast in the part. I thought, I'll do this pilot. That'll give me enough money to go up to Big Sur and hang out and write songs. But the pilot got picked up. So that was another start point, because I still thought, I'll do it for this first half season. We came out at mid-season, but I was having a good time. It didn't seem to be a reason to leave it right away.
No, you had a hell of a run. I mean, most people, you came, you had a handful of appearances, small parts in films, made for TV films, and Barney Miller, that had an eight-year run. That's a hell of a run for, especially to be so early in a career. That had to be a dream come true.
Yeah, well, it was 7.5 seasons, actually. We came on as half season. We came on at mid-season. But, yeah, I guess. It's always about just creativity and growing and stuff, So there was a part of me. I escaped into television as a kid.
Oh, me too.
At school, I just watched a lot of TV. Mm-hmm. And so there was something about that world. Obviously, I kept making choices that went in that direction. And at the same time, it really was the first couple of times that, it's like, well, am I going to leave now? And I stick around. As I say, I was having a good time. And then a friend of mine who was friends with an artist, a Native American artist named Buffy St. Marie. And Buffy had been part of the, there was a point where when there was like Buffy and Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were the kind of the folk movement as it became more socially conscious or more contemporarily, because there was always Woody Guthrie and, but as music during that time, had kind of out of a folk background, but dealing with the times. And then Buffy got sort of blacklisted because her message was a lot stronger, because her message was looking at how Indian people had been dealt with. And at the time she was working on Sesame Street, she had her first child with Sheldon Wolfchild, her husband, at the time, and they were on Sesame Street as a Native American couple, and she was trying to put together a tour to Australia, and I ended up, meeting with her and with those, and the tour didn't happen, but some of the Indian people who had been involved in the American Indian movement, it was their kind of expression of the civil rights movement. It was a kind of reassertion of sovereignty rights for Native people. It's in the Constitution and in the law of the land that the treaties are supposed to be honored, but most of them hadn't been. Mm-hmm. So I ended up, one in particular, Floyd Westerman, who was a singer-songwriter, and a lot of people might know him. He was in the movie Dances with Wolves. He played the old chief, and he was in The Doors. And he was on Roseanne, and he ended up having an acting career, but he's best known in the Native community for his songs that are about how Indian people feel about the world and the things that have happened, and where their sense of strength and spirit come from, and it just it connected me in with some things on a lot of levels that both from my sort of spiritual or religious path, and as I mentioned, it was in the economics and all that, and there was just a whole other way of looking at how we relate to the resources that are here on the earth for us to survive as a species, and how we think about that. That was really different from the dominant culture, which was kind of about, is it capitalism versus communism? Both that, kind of grew out of the Industrial Revolution. So there was not a real understanding of things that now we're looking at by not understanding what we're doing. Now we're dealing with this climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us are. Some people are in denial, but anyway, so there's my long answer to your short question. How did you get started?
What?
It's always, maybe because I'm a triple Aries or something, but I mean, to me, it's always starting,
I want to ask you two things before I ask you about the documentaries you're working on now. My first question is a Barney Miller question. Most sitcoms back then, actually almost every sitcom back then, was either a family. It was a family, with the wacky hijinks, and every cop show was, just a straight cop drama. Yours was basically a comedy of cops in a precinct. And police, if I recall at the time, really supported it and loved the show. What do you think made that one so different than anything to this day out there? What do you think was that made it such a hit with everyone?
Well, I think, there's a lot of sides to that too, because a lot of it was good writing, and we weren't trying to just do jokes, and we ended up shooting very differently in the way most comedy shows were done. The way that most were done, they would have a studio audience, they'd have a comedian, and sometimes a band, so they would have the audience, which was already all teed up, because remember those days there were only 3 networks and PBS.
Mm-hmm.
If you made it to Hollywood and got a ticket to go and be watching a studio show, that was like, wow, this is really exciting, and so it was all tuned to keep that kind of high hilarity sort of thing, and most of the writing was jokes and punchlines, and a situation. That's where situation comedy. But Danny wrote. There were always at least 2 storylines, and sometimes even a third that might interweave with each other in a certain way during the show. And so there was that. There was that he didn't like that what was called 3-camera switch feed, where you pretty much make up mind ahead of time how it was going to be edited.
Mm-hmm.
And Danny had been an editor, and so we ended up taking 4 cameras and taping all 4 cameras, and then later on they had, so there were things that are maybe a little too geeky for the average person thinking about it, but things that went into the show as it developed, but it became more and more about characters, and the guests were wonderful actors who had something to play, because a lot of times on other shows the guests were just there to kind of feed punchlines, and and I think as far as police, well, it was more about what most police time is spent doing. And we didn't get much into the violent aspect, but in those days, TV, the sort of violence or the action was pretty stupid anyway. Jumping over, pulling your gun, and it was pretty it was, just kind of a form or a format, that just wasn't very realistic. And so there were a lot of things about Barney Miller that, weren't realistic on those points of view, but mostly police are just dealing with people, in weird situations, and they don't very often pull their guns and stuff, and so I think that's why. I do know that police, there was always the crack, who was it, the Daryl Gates, who was the chief of the police in L.A., he said, in New York they think of Barney Miller as a documentary. But out here we were, so there was that kind of, because L.A. had much more of a military kind of approach to policing. They took a lot of pride in sharp and physically fit and stuff like that.
Do you think spinning?
Anyway,
Do you think spinning?
That's what.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Do you think taking Abe Vigoda's character, who was, he's Abe Vigoda, for God's sakes, do you think spinning him off into his own show was a bad idea, or was it worth the try?
Well, it didn't really work out. A lot of that was, the network, if they get a show that's a hit, which it took us a little while. We got great reviews right away, and we never became, I think we were always around somewhere between 10 and 12 once we hit stride. We weren't like a number one show or something. But part of that, because we were up against the Waltons, so there was a divided audience. The Waltons was an hour show, family show, and so I think nonetheless, Abe was the logical one in the network if they could do a spin-off and find an audience. So they took that route. I don't think Danny really wanted to write a spin-off, but he was kind of obligated to, both in his contract and also in his own drive as growing up poor to, don't turn on any chance of making more money. Mm-hmm. But I don't think his heart was really in it. And and it was just a very different, now you're seeing Abe at home, Fish at home, and it just didn't quite happen. It started well, but it didn't keep going. And when it was over, I guess it just never, it never worked out to bring Fish back to Barney Miller. And I don't know, it's interesting. There's a fellow who was his manager who I talked to a few, week or so ago, who was writing a play on Abe, and he wanted to know if I had any thoughts on it. And he's written a lot of one-person plays, and this one is on Abe. And, for him, his take on it was that there was a lot of conflict between Danny and Abe about how his character was treated or whatever. I don't remember all of that. Mm-hmm. Abe was on and did theater most of his life. When he got the part in The Godfather, that was a big deal for him. Mm-hmm. And but he had his craft. He had his gifts, which is why he was so good in The Godfather. And so I think he felt like maybe it should be more like he should have a bigger role. And then when they did a spinoff, I think he felt. I think the two of them each felt they had deserved more credit for the success of Fish than they were getting from the other guy. Because this happens amongst people,
Oh yeah. Now you got
they both contributed because Danny was a wonderful writer, and he created the character, and he had a sense of what that was. But on the other hand, Abe had a great gift for making it all work so naturally. So anyway,
now when Barney Miller ended, you got to be in. It's considered, not just by me, I can back it up with proof, one of the greatest comedies of the 80s. You got to play Harold, the owner of the DC Cab Company in DC Cab.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, when you go back in time and look at it, that cast, I mean, Gary Busey, Paul Rodriguez, Bill Maher, Adam Baldwin. Adam Baldwin only done like a couple films at that point. Did you see the magic you had there? Like all these people to go on to such, Mr. T, for God's sakes, to just explode over the years.
Yeah, well, when I went in and met with Joel Schumacher, who before that he'd been Woody Allen's wardrobe guy, and then he directed a film called Car Wash, which was really kind of like an ended musical. I mean, he really opened up a new genre for telling story and having music, and it had a whole lot of characters. And so he got picked to direct this movie that was based on a black cab company in Washington, D.C. called Capital Cab, and written by Copper and Alice Carew, who were African-American couple, producer, writers, and stuff. But Universal, bought into it with the idea, let's bring in other characters and other things, and then they hired Joel to direct it, so then it became more like that. But I felt like it had a chance to be the first of a whole franchise. I thought it used, and we talked about this, used the same kind of look at the world situation with these characters, that there could be a DC Cab 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
If we really looked at some of the things that we were involved, but Joel was much more about touching on it all very, very lightly. You can get laughs on different levels of depth, and Gary was we were friends. We met through a mutual friend, Raul Julia, who was a wonderful actor who died way too. And Gary, a lot of my job on that film was making sure Gary got to work. We both lived out in Malibu. We would take turns driving, but it was best when he drove, because he had no concern at all about when the traffic was thick, just getting over into that left and, strip. It wasn't even a lane, just barreling down there. So it was kind of a romp. T became the big story that summer. His Rocky stuff had come out, and so even though we were all, I think, alphabetical order, favored nations billing, but it came out with the poster. They had, so everybody's name is there, in the same size across the bottom, but the picture on the poster is a big one of Mr. T ripping off the cab door.
I have that poster.
With the rest of us in the cab or something, So that was, it was, like I say, it was a romp, and, it was fun in a way. Bill Maher was, I was trying to get Bill to be way more political about his character. He was just trying to make sure that he didn't get, it was, you were, how old were you when DC Cab came out? Probably
first time I saw DC Cab, I would have been, I was 9 years old.
9 years old.
Saw
Okay,
the movie feed here at age 9, and I've seen it probably 30 times since.
Yes, especially that girl with her boobs showing.
Oh God, yes.
You had
a hot wife in that movie too. I remember she threw you out. You had a flamethrower your way in there.
Yeah, well, there was, it's like, so for me, it was fun. Like you said, there's a segment of the population age-wise, and then demographics. There are a lot of places where DC Cab, that's people that see me, they go, oh, DC Cab, yeah, and so I felt like, it was fun to be a part of it. I wished we had gone a little deeper on the stuff. For instance, Harold, he's a Vietnam vet. So there were all kinds of things to look at in there around vets, and and then drugs or pot or whatever. But no, they're not going to do anything. We're not going to have any bongs. We're not going to have anything. He's a beer drinker. A flamethrower. A real flamethrower.
That was a great addition, by the way.
But it was funny on that level, and my own life experience changed a lot after that. I did a short-lived TV show, and I got married. Actually, I had been there. My wife at the time was quite pregnant when we were shooting in Washington, and not long after our daughter was born, we found out that my wife had cancer, and then there was sort of 2 years of dealing with that, and then there was I found myself a single mom, and I worked some, but I wasn't able to take a series like there was looked like I might be able to do that Quantum Leap. But I just realized I can't do an hour-long series where I'm working 10, 12 hours a day. I gotta, so that was a real shift in my life path. And, now my daughter's 37 and she has near 4-year-old twins herself, twin girls. So, life goes on. And Joel went on to direct a lot of really wonderful movies, and Bill, has turned to be one of the most interesting and provocative, sort of thinkers of our time, staying with the obligation to be funny and at the same time tell his truth. And he doesn't make everybody happy with it, but he's had quite a career. And
was Gary Busey insane back then?
Pardon me?
Was Gary Busey insane back then, or did that just happen over the years?
Gary's always been kind of a wild guy like that. He's brilliant. He's a really smart guy. His dad, very smart native, by the way. His dad, I remember once telling about his dad, would he'd have Gary wash the car, and then he'd come out, and, there'd be a little tiny spot, and he'd get all over him and stuff. So he had a lot of that. He was a wonderful drummer. A guy that can take stage with anybody. I mean, he just has got such energy. But sometimes he gets, especially if he, starts doing some cocaine or something, which at that time he was doing. So I consider him a friend. We are friends. There are times where I just don't, it's not like we hang out all the time, but, I know his son Jake, since he was a teenager. I know he's got another young son now, so Gary, there was a time in there where his thing was taking words and turning them into acronyms. And the one that I always remember I liked the most, he had a lot of them, but was failing, finding another important lesson, inviting needed growth. So he had a whole bunch of them like that, and he could go preacher on you. And, with that kind of energy in a way. But it was a wild scene. Gary and Mr. T and the Barbarian Brothers were always, you might say, oh, it looks like your arms are a little like your brother's arms are a little bigger today. I don't know. What do you think? That would, he'd spend the rest of the day kind of looking at his biceps, and they were huge, what I mean?
Oh, yeah. And David just passed away a few months ago.
Yeah. I'm not sure what that was all about. Oh my gosh, there's a guy that African American guy who's I've always loved, an older guy, and his name has just slipped out of my head. Such an unusual name. It was like you said, there was quite a cast there. What's his name? You mentioned him. I'm having brain freeze.
Paul Rodriguez, Adam Alda.
Yeah. Well, Paul Rodriguez. Paul had a line that ran through the movie. He'd say, I know what we need to do. We need to do. He'd get everybody's attention. We need to do something. So he used to, because all the comedians, they were always outdoing each other in the set. It was wild, and I think Joel just wanted to keep that energy going. So. But when he'd see my wife Willie, who was, like I say, almost 9 months pregnant, and he'd come up, he'd go, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl, but it's going to be something. When the baby was born, and I was sleeping on the floor in the room, and this elder nurse came in to get the information on the baby's name. And I'm not sure. She just seemed to kind of be having a bad morning, or I don't know. She didn't think I should be there, or something. She didn't like. Says does the child have a middle name? And we looked at each other. We said, yes, it's Sunting. Said, how do you spell that? She didn't get, so we spelled it Sunting.
That's great.
And that's her legal middle name, Sunting.
Sunting.
So.
Was there talk of doing a sequel to that?
No, I don't think so. I think Joe went on to other offers, and it did all right.
Oh, classic!
Maybe there was talk, but none was ever made. But so I just think it just didn't. It didn't really dig deep enough into what was going on in the world, which I thought could have been done as well, and sort of work on a little more grown-up level, as well as on the level as a kind of teen romp kind of film that it was. In the same way that the great Disney musical animated stories, the good ones, they work on an adult level as well as on a child's level.
I mean, you did it would take hours to go through your filmography, but I want to skip ahead, and you got into directing documentaries, a lot of Native American documentaries, a lot of work, nuclear and stuff like that. How did all that come about?
Yeah, all right. Well, first, I didn't really do a lot, but I did what I could. The way it came about was that in that time I was talking about meeting Buffy and meeting these other people, and I found a lot of insights and understandings, and I really feel like that connection in my life, which a lot of things opened up to me because I was identified. People in the Indian world knew who I was, so especially the people who were politically active, they didn't have to worry about who is this guy that's around and wants to know everything, because there had been some people who were actually kind of sent in by the FBI. Mm-hmm. Those were the days of COINTELPRO, so any of the movements were dealing with a lot of pushback and a lot of things that just saw them only as the kind of criminal element or a dangerous element, an anti-American element. And so there was reason for people to be a little guarded, but they knew who I was, and then also I was connected with something that had really smart humor about what's going on in the world. And Indian people have a sort of a reputation for being very somber and serious all the time, and and they'll clam up if they're around people that don't really have a clue, which is a lot of people in America, because a lot of there's just not something that's really taught. But it's not understood. But in the Indian world, there's a lot of teasing and a lot of humor, and it's the more serious the situation, the more important humor is. So I was able to become friends with a wide range of people and be at events and gatherings and ceremonies and stuff, and then I also started doing benefits because I was in my music and playing, and I had connected with Floyd, who was, as I say, a singer-songwriter. And so there were a lot of times that we would do benefits in Seattle or Chicago or LA or whatever. And there would always seem to be people there that they'd never been around a crowd like that. And they were, just kind of touched with, wow, this is a great feeling. This view of life from being native and dealing with all of that, even though there's a huge amount, the people that have come through a Holocaust, so there's a huge amount of what these days some people call generational trauma, things that happened with a whole generation that got shipped off to boarding schools, couldn't speak their language and couldn't practice their religion and couldn't go home. And, so there's a lot of pain, but there's also a lot of joy and humor and insight and connect to life and each other. And around that time, portable video was showing up. The television stations, news stations, had these 3/4-inch tape decks, that were pretty cumbersome, but that was it. This was before satellite. Our remote cable, our remote tape, so that was available. And the half-inch stuff that was making it hadn't gotten in the stores yet, but it was being seeded out amongst the professionals. And I felt, wow, there's a way to share what's going on in this other part of my life, that is so rich and so meaningful. And so I set about, doing that, just having the cameras and traveling and sharing, and a lot of people who are documentary filmmakers who would, scrape together whatever they could to buy a certain amount of 16 millimeter film that they could afford to shoot and have developed. Mm-hmm. So they had to be really careful, and boy, with tape, tape was cheap. You could just shoot and shoot and shoot. And so I set about to make something that I called a docu-musical. I was hoping to get something regularly on the nighttime, late night TV. And it was kind of, sort of telling a story about things going on in the world, and at the same time, music being as much of it as not. And it all turned out to be a little too radical for ABC. The show kind of wound up. This was 1980. We elected Ronald Reagan that year. The show closed down. All those tapes ended up on, in a back hall closet for some years while I dealt with my other family stuff. But that's where that started. So I created a company to be able to do that called Full Circle. But at one point we were up on the Mohawk Reservation in upstate New York, and there was a conflict going on there, and we brought up a video team that they knew about, it all women team that came up and shot some of the interviews and things we did to try to tell that story. And I think the biggest impact was the fact that we were there kept something that might have spilled much more into a violent confrontation between state police and traditional Mohawks. But because I was there kind of going back and forth and everything, it defused that a little bit. It was, I had a point and I lost it.
That happens to me all the time.
I had a point I wanted to make. But I know they were working on a film. They call themselves Human Arts Foundation, and they were working on a film on Agent Orange, and that was an issue at the time. Mm-hmm. Trying to get the government to deal with it and the chemical companies, and so I was still working. I was able to put some money into it, and I narrated it, and they it was a pretty important film. One of the things that we finally got a chemical company to talk with us, and it came out that, one of the reasons they had trouble proving that Agent Orange was the cause of so many issues with birth defects and there were a lot of issues connected with Agent Orange. But one of the things was it was hard to prove that all of your, in Vietnam it was much worse because the same defoliant had been spread all over the back roads all over America. It was and there was an ingredient in there that was kind of a side product that was the cause of these difficulties. So I worked on that, and then, it just kind of led me into that world. But I have to say, in terms of my own accomplishments, other than supporting people who, had more of that as their calling, so they actually got it done. I went right at the place. I was hoping this year to have all of that stuff digitized and kind of be making it available because it's 40 years after 1980. This was throughout 1980, and so we've come around kind of full cycle of that, But I just haven't been able to get it all digitized and get that done. I had to keep working and have all these wonderful grandkids. I had 7 grandkids in 6 years. So I know I'm just rolling on here sort of motor mounting, but they're good questions, and this is kind of what comes up for me when you ask them.
And they're good answers, too.
What's next?
Well, I guess, I'll finish you off with 2. What do you prefer, directing, television work, or film work?
Well, they all have work involved. All for that. But directing, that what happened there was that we would do this show, and we would, do it in front of the studio audience the first year. But when they went home, then we'd start at the beginning redoing every scene. So we might use the studio audience reaction to just getting up and walking to the bathroom or something. But for the most part, the audiences, particularly after the show got on the air, they were so eager to laugh that it kind of made it just, a lot of the humor in Barney Miller was kind of build up. There was a little funny, and then this funny, and then that funny, and then something tied it all together. And so, but Danny would come down and he'd take over for the director. There was probably still is a rule or a law that you couldn't write, direct, and produce. You could do 2 of them. Somewhere the union said, we gotta. So anyway, but Danny would come down and take over, and that would end up being a kind of a psychological crushing experience for the person who was hired to direct. Because so Al and I went to Danny and said, listen, why don't we direct, and we'll do the part you don't like, where we're working out, the timing and how it's supposed to happen. What if we did this scene here, and then Harris walks in here? There's a lot you have to kind of figure out so that it can just flow like it just happened. People say, "Oh, you guys just improv that." No, we didn't. And then you come down and take over, and we won't have to deal with nursemaiding the director through this kind of crushing. So that's how that happened, that we directed. But then Noam Pitlick came on, and Noam had been on as a kind of a watcher, at the beginning, a very talented guy, and he started directing the show. Then he had a heart attack, and then he had to, but he was working all night. I mean, he was crazed trying to make this show work, and so that's how that happened. And I think I have good impulses as an actor, but there's a whole lot about, especially on other, single cameras and stuff, there's a whole lot about lenses and film and lighting and all of that. And I just never, a lot of people, are in series and then they end up directing a lot of shows. They learn that stuff, my life didn't didn't take me in that direction. So I would be, somebody would have to have some crazy idea that they really wanted me to direct something and really come after me about it, and I don't expect that to happen. As far as film and TV, a lot of it's just so much depends on the writing. There's stage, there's certain things about stage, and there's certain things about, within TV. I just had this run on a soap. That's a whole other experience from doing a sitcom, which is a whole other experience from doing an hour-long episodic single-camera show.
And you won an Emmy for that, Primetime Emmy, correct?
I did get an Emmy, yes. It was a wonderful storyline, and it's been frankly, when I went in to read, I was kind of like, oh man, if it comes to this, I'm reading for a soap opera, because there's kind of this idea that, the soap is kind of bottom of the pile. It's not so, and there are a lot of wonderful actors. Some have gone on to become big movie stars, some just stayed in soaps and do wonderful work. It's just a different form of storytelling, which I found really wonderful, that kind of every day it just keeps unfolding,
mm-hmm.
And so what comes up for me when I hear that question, it's not exactly the same thing, but Barbara, Harris, Barbara, who played Barney's wife.
Yeah, yes, Harris, I believe you're right.
Yeah, wonderful person and wonderful actress. I mean, she had done, musical comedy and serious drama on Broadway, and but she was talking one time about people ask her, how do you act Shakespeare? She says, you don't act Shakespeare, you learn to act. You don't learn to act Shakespeare, you learn to act, and then you do Shakespeare. So there's something about acting. There are a lot of approaches, everybody, because you're working with your own self, you're kind of your own pink box, and at the same time, there's a wide range of, just like with music, how many ways are there to play a guitar,
Mm-hmm.
But it is, that part of it, that part of seeking truth in an imaginative experience, and that part of the collaborative nature, whether it's a play or a TV or a film, you're working with a whole bunch of other people. Everybody's bringing their own particular wardrobe, lighting, sound, camera, different other characters, makeup. It's all this kind of collaborative thing about telling some kind of story that has some kind of worth in it, in the experience of doing it and the experience of sharing it with people who will come in with their willing suspension of disbelief and make it happen, because it doesn't happen until there's an audience, I mean, even if the audience is the camera crew or whatever, that's so, if it's work, I'm happy to be doing it. I've learned that I love doing it. I don't like auditioning so much because you're kind of shooting in the dark many times, unless it's just clear, unless you just get from the character and what you've gotten of the story, you get what's going on there, or at least what you need to bring something to it. A lot of times you don't. So you're kind of, it's kind of like walking out and turning around and walking back and saying some lines, but you're not really having a chance to take your swing.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for people trying to get started in the business today?
My advice has come to be, that if you do it with the idea in mind of growing as a person, that it can be a wonderful path, and if it ends up, with a work or a career or something, that can be wonderful. But it's all about growing as a person and exploring life, which you want to be doing anyway. But if you do it because you think that the perks of fame and fortune are going to be so great, that it's just worth kind of burying your soul and putting yourself out there in ways that, can be, I just say, if you do that, it'll never be enough to make it worth it.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us today. You know, I appreciate it. I know all the fans appreciate it. I'd like to have you back on again one day, but I want to thank you once again so much for taking the time to join us. I really do appreciate it.
Likewise, and as I told you when we first talked, I think you have a great energy, and you have a kind of down to earth integrity. So I'm sure you got people listening to you that enjoy the conversations you have with people, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And yes, let's do it again sometime.
I would hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. You have been listening to the Chronicles of Hollywood History. Thank you from Gomez Richmond Productions.